Welcome to Story Loft, where we share uplifting stories that inspire and brighten your day. Today, we've gathered 5 incredible true stories that will warm your heart and renew your faith in the power of kindness, love, and caring. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. And if you have a story that needs to be shared, send it to storyloft@outlook.com. Your story could inspire thousands. Okay, let's begin. I'm 19 years old, and I'm honored to be the first recipient of the Harriet Green Scholarship. Growing up in a small town, I always dreamed of going to college, but it seemed like there was always something standing in the way. My parents worked hard to provide for our family, but there was never much left over for anything extra, like savings for tuition. I worked tirelessly in school, focusing on my grades, hoping they would be enough to secure a standard scholarship. I knew that without financial aid, attending college would be impossible. But when the results of my entrance exams came back, I was crushed. I had missed the eligibility cutoff for a scholarship by just a single point. The disappointment was overwhelming, and I felt as though all my hard work had been for nothing. Without that scholarship, college seemed like an unreachable dream. Then one day, while flipping through the newspaper, I stumbled across an article about a woman named Harriet Green, a seamstress from a nearby town who had worked for over 60 years mending clothes and sewing for the community. Despite living a humble life, Harriet had managed to save up a small fortune, and in an act of extraordinary generosity, she donated nearly $100,000 to a local university to fund a scholarship for students from underprivileged backgrounds. The story of her selflessness took my breath away. It wasn't just about the money. It was the spirit behind her gift that moved me deeply. Harriet, a woman with no children of her own, had chosen to help others achieve what she had never had the opportunity to do herself. I couldn't help but share the article with my mother. We both agreed it was a beautiful thing. It was a reflection of true compassion. The next morning, I made my way to the university's financial aid office, hoping for some sort of financial aid. The staff told me that there were no scholarships available at the time, but they promised they would contact me if something came up. I left the office feeling disappointment and uncertain, but I decided to hold on to the hope that I had within me. A few days later, as I was getting ready to leave for work with my mother, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but something told me to pick it up. To my shock, it was the financial aid office, and they were calling to tell me that I had been selected to receive the very first Harriet Green Scholarship. I couldn't believe it. My heart was racing as I ran out of the house to tell my mother. She had to call the office herself to confirm. It felt like a dream, too good to be true, but it was real, and I was overjoyed. I first met Harriet at a ceremony held in her honor, and when I saw her, I instantly felt a connection. Meeting her was like finding a long-lost family member. Harriet never married and had no children, so over time, she embraced my family as her own. She became a fixture in our lives. She talks to my grandmother on the phone nearly every week. She joins us for holiday meals, and she even comes along when we run errands for grocery shopping. One day we were talking about food, and Harriet casually mentioned that she had never really had much experience with pizza. We were all so surprised by this that we immediately decided to take her to our local pizzeria, where she had her first slice. She was delighted, and now she orders pizza with us every Friday night. It's become a tradition that we all look forward to. Harriet's work ethic was incredible. For decades, she worked tirelessly, sewing clothes by hand for people in the community. I used to drive past her small house on my way to school, never realizing it was hers. I always admired how neat and well kept the yard was, the flowers blooming, and the porch always spotless. It wasn't until years later that I found out that the house belonged to Harriet. I asked her once why I never saw her outside, and she just laughed, explaining, I guess I was just always out back, sewing away. There wasn't much time to be out front. Now that Harriet is retired, she spends her days enjoying the quiet places of life, reading her Bible, and reflecting on the years she worked so hard. Despite her slower pace, she's far more inactive. Every time I visit her house, there's a new award or recognition hanging on her wall, plaques, certificates, and even invitations to special ceremonies. She's been invited to speak at the state capitol, and she's been recognized for her contributions to the community. But through it all, she remains incredibly humble. We had to convince her to get a DVR so she could record the TV segments about her life, as she's been featured on several news programs. She's always so modest, just smiling and saying, "It's nothing, just doing what I can." What Harriet gave me wasn't just financial support to pursue my education. It was a lesson in generosity, humility, and the power of giving back. Her life is a reminder that hard work, kindness, and compassion can change the lives of others. Her selflessness has inspired me to give back whenever I can. I hope to contribute to the Harriet Green Scholarship Fund in the future to help other students just like me. Harriet has become so much more than a benefactor. She's become like a second grandmother to me. When I graduate from college, I know she'll be sitting proudly in the audience, right there between my mother and grandmother, supporting me as I take the next big step in the future. And in that moment, I'll know she's where she belongs. Family, right by my side. Nothing had ever weighed on James quite like the day he drove behind the moving truck that was carrying his dear friend Margaret to a seniors' housing complex. The fading autumn sunlight caught the yellow leaves of the trees lining the road, but the beauty of the day felt hollow. In his pocket, he still held the note Margaret had scribbled on the back of an old envelope. "I don't belong here." But Margaret had no choice. After a fall that left her unable to walk, unaided, and months of struggling to keep up with bills, her small apartment on the edge of town had to be given up. James had done all he could to help her, but even his efforts couldn't stop the inevitable. Margaret's new home would be a shared room in an assisted living facility far from the independence she'd treasured for so long. Margaret had been James's neighbor when he had first moved to the area. She lived in a cozy 2-bedroom bungalow, her porch overflowing with plants and wind chimes, and the welcoming scent of baked goods. James had been a lonely college graduate at the time, and Margaret, a retired librarian with a penchant for storytelling, had taken him under her wing. Over countless cups of tea and homemade bread, she shared stories of her adventures, tales of different places she'd visited, and the oddities she'd collected over the years. Her home was like stepping into another world, full of books, photos, and little mementos of a life well lived. But now, that world was gone. The seniors' home was not unpleasant, not by any objective measure. It was bright and modern, with friendly staff and regular activities for the residents. But Margaret had always been fiercely independent, and the idea of losing control over her life had broken her heart. "It feels like the last chapter has been written," she said quietly to James before the move. The first few weeks were hard on both of them. James tried to visit often, but each time he entered the facility, he felt the weight of her unspoken disappointment. Margaret's once lively demeanor had faded into something subdued. She spoke less, moved less, and seemed to retreat into herself. One afternoon, James stopped by unannounced, determined to lift her spirits. He brought with him a small box of her belongings that had been left behind during the move. A framed photo of her late husband, a faded scarf she'd always worn in the winter, and a small wooden box he'd found tucked inside of a drawer. When he entered the room, she was sitting by the window, staring at the courtyard. The careful decorations on the wall and her pastel curtains did little to brighten the emptiness in her eyes. "James," she said, managing a smile when she saw him. "What a surprise." "I thought you might like some familiar things," he said, handing her the box. Margaret opened it slowly, her fingers lingering on each item. She smiled as she pulled out the scarf and wrapped it around her shoulders. When she reached the wooden box, however, she paused. "I haven't seen this in years," she murmured, opening the lid. Inside was a small collection of letters, yellowed with age. "What are these?" James asked. Margaret hesitated before answering. "These are notes I've kept from people I've helped over the years. Students, neighbors, strangers, people who wrote to thank me for something I'd done for them." James watched as she unfolded one of the letters. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she read aloud. "Dear Margaret, thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Your kindness gave me the courage to keep going." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "I used to read these whenever I felt like I wasn't making a difference. They reminded me that even small gestures matter." James felt a lump form in his throat. "You've always made a difference, Margaret. You've done more for me than I can ever repay." Margaret looked at him, her expression softening. "Sometimes I forget that. Being here, it makes me feel invisible." James sat with her for hours that afternoon, reading through the letters and reminiscing about the people whose lives she had touched. By the time he left, Margaret seemed lighter, as though she had rediscovered a part of herself that had been lost. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began to change. She joined a book club at the seniors' home and started sharing stories with other residents. She even began writing letters again, this time to her neighbors, notes of encouragement and small gestures of gratitude. Later on, when James visited one day, he found her room filled with life. Photos and cards adorned the walls, and a small group of residents was gathered around her, listening intently as she recounted a story about her travels. As James sat quietly in the corner watching her, Margaret caught his eye and smiled. She realized then that she hadn't lost herself. She had simply needed time to adjust, to find a way to bring her kindness and warmth into this new chapter of her life. "Thank you," she said softly when the others had left. "For what?" "For reminding me who I am." James grinned. "I didn't do anything. That's just who you've always been." As he left that day, James felt a sense of peace. Margaret's heart hadn't changed, and wherever her heart was, that is where her home would always be. It was a stormy night in the heart of Alabama. The clock had just struck 11:30, and the rain poured down in unrelenting sheets, obscuring the faint glow of distant headlights. On the side of a lonely highway, an older African-American woman stood next to her car, her soaked clothes clinging to her as she shivered against the biting wind. The vehicle had sputtered to a halt earlier in the evening, and after trying unsuccessfully to fix it, she realized she had no choice but to flag down a passing motorist. The Deep South in the 1960s was a place fraught with tensions, where acts of kindness between strangers often met the shadow of suspicion. Yet, as the woman raised her hand, the rain streaming down her face, she clung to the hope that someone, anyone, would stop. Minutes passed like hours as car after car sped by, splashing water onto the roadside without slowing. Finally, headlights cut through the storm and slowed as they neared her. She stepped back cautiously, shielding her eyes from the glare. The car came to a stop, and a young white man stepped out into the rain. His clothes were very quickly drenched, but he walked towards her without hesitation. Such a gesture of kindness was uncommon, even daring, given the racial climate of the time. "Ma'am, do you need some help?" he asked, his voice steady and warm despite the storm. Relief washed over her. "Yes, thank you," she said, her voice trembling from both the cold and her desperation. "My car broke down and I need to get to the city. It's urgent." The man nodded. Without asking for details, he guided her to his car, carefully helping her into the passenger seat. "Let's get you somewhere safe first," he said as he closed the door and jogged around to the driver's side. As they drove, the woman clutched to her purse tightly. Her knuckles were white. She glanced at the man, noticing how he focused on the road despite the storm's ferocity. She was used to wary glances, to hesitation, but this man seemed driven by a simple desire to help. She offered quiet directions, and he navigated the treacherous roads with care, finally pulling up to a small gas station. The man stepped out again, speaking quickly with the attendant and arranging for a taxi to meet them. The woman sat silently, glancing at her watch every few minutes. Her urgency was palpable, though she hadn't shared her reason. The man returned and opened her door. "There's a cab on the way," he said, helping her out of his car and leading her under the station's awning to shield her from the rain. "They'll get you where you need to go." The woman looked up at him. Her eyes were glassy, overcome with emotion because of his generosity. "You didn't have to stop," she said softly. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I'm glad I did." She reached into her purse and pulled out a notepad, quickly scribbling something down. "Please," she said, handing him the paper, "give me your address. I want to thank you properly." The man hesitated, but eventually obliged, writing down his information. She gave him a small, tight smile, clutching the paper as if it were a lifeline. Moments later, the taxi arrived. The man helped her into the cab, shielding her from the rain with his coat as she slid into the seat. With a wave, she disappeared into the night. A week passed, and the incident drifted into the back of the man's mind. He had no way of knowing whether the woman had made it to her destination or why she had been in such a rush. Life went on as usual, until 7 days later when a delivery truck pulled into his driveway. The young man opened the door, surprised to see 2 workers carefully maneuvering a giant box up the step. It was a luxurious console unit, a combination color television and stereo record player. State of the art for the time. "Are you sure this is for me?" he asked, bewildered. "Yes, sir," one of the delivery men replied, handing him an envelope. This came with it. The man opened the note, and as he read the words, his breath caught in his throat. "Dear Mr. James, thank you so much for assisting me on the highway the other night. The rain drenched not only my clothes but my spirits. Then you came along. Because of you, I was able to make it to my dying husband's bedside just before he passed away. God bless you for helping me and unselfishly serving others. Sincerely, Miss Nat King Cole." The young man stood there in stunned silence, holding the letter in one hand while staring at the remarkable gift in his living room. He had no idea that the woman he had helped that stormy night was the wife of one of the most famous musicians in the world. What struck him the most wasn't the gift, though, as generous as it was. It was the realization that his small act of kindness had allowed someone to share a moment of profound love and farewell. He would remember the rainy night not for what he gave, but for what it gave back. Simple compassion can change lives in ways we may never fully understand. On a chilly spring day in 1944, I stood at the altar, my heart full of excitement, as I exchanged vows with the man I loved. My new husband, Thomas, wore his crisp Air Force uniform, looking every bit the handsome, determined man I had fallen for. But our time together was short. Just 8 months into our marriage, Thomas received orders to serve overseas during the height of World War II. He was bound for an undisclosed location in Europe, and no one knew when or even if he would return. Before he left, we made a promise, a simple yet powerful one. We promised to write each other every single day we were apart. We decided that each letter would be numbered, ensuring that none would be lost or forgotten. The distance between us became bearable through our words, though on many days those words amounted to little more than, "I miss you" and "I love you." But no matter what, those words were always there. Thomas, an Air Force mechanic, found himself right in the middle of some of the fiercest fighting, from the bloody beaches of Normandy to the tense standoff in Berlin. His role in the war placed him in harm's way, but still, every day without failure, he would write to me. His letters often arrived battered, marked with the wear of travel and time. but they always carried with them the same sense of love and commitment. On occasion, Thomas managed to find more than just time for writing. He would make me small, thoughtful gifts from materials he had scavenged from his surroundings. One such gift arrived in the summer of 1944, when he was stationed in England. He had fashioned a delicate silver necklace using scraps of wire and metal he had found in an old barn. The pendant, a simple circle, was engraved with the words, "Until I return." It was a promise, one I clung to as the months dragged on. The hardest part was not hearing from him. There were days and even weeks when I would hear nothing. The uncertainty and fear would wash over me, leaving me anxious and uncertain of his safety. I knew that many of his comrades had already fallen, and I feared I would never hear from him again. But then, as if the universe were on our side, the mail would catch up and a stack of letters would arrive, each one numbered and dated, would give me a glimpse of his life, his thoughts, and his unwavering love for me. One letter, written when Thomas was still stationed in Paris, still makes me smile. He had asked me to send my measurements for a pair of silk pajamas he planned to have made by a famous local tailor. I sent my measurements, though the army censor had blacked out the numbers, thinking I was sending a secret code. Despite the censored letter, the pajamas arrived, and somehow they fit perfectly. It felt like magic. It was proof of our bond even through the chaos of war. By the time 1946 arrived, the war was over. After more than 2 years and 3 months apart, Thomas was finally returning home. We had spoken only once by phone throughout the entire war, but through our daily letters, we had shared everything, the loneliness, the fears, the hopes for the future. And when he stepped off the train and into my arms, I knew nothing would ever be the same. We had exchanged 1,716 letters during our time apart. The first months after his return were a whirlwind. The post-war housing shortage made finding a place to live nearly impossible, but we managed to secure a small one-bedroom apartment in the heart of San Francisco. It wasn't much, but it was ours. The walls were bare and the floors creaked with age, but we were together, and that was all that matters. As our family grew, so did the stories of our early years together. We often told our children and grandchildren about our letters, how we wrote to each other even on the hardest days, how we shared our dreams and fears, how each letter was a lifeline to the other. Over the years, we kept very few of those letters. With each move, we had to part with more and more of our belongings, and eventually we let go of the letters, not realizing how precious they were at the time. Still, the memories of them remain with me, etched in my heart. Now, as we celebrate 60 years of marriage, I look back on those early days with a sense of wonder. Though the physical letters are gone, the love we shared during the time is still very much alive. We've never been apart for long, since the war ended, but we've never stopped showing each other the same devotion we shared through those written words. Our love has only deepened, and each day feels like a new chapter to our story. And even though I no longer have those letters to open, every day feels like a letter from Thomas, written in the small acts of love, the shared laughter, and the quiet moments we still find together. He is my greatest gift, my constant companion, and the man who, through war and peace, kept his promise to love me, no matter the distance. In today's world, where instant gratification is the norm, we often forget the true meaning of the holiday season. The idea of giving heartfelt gifts, those that show we care without the need for spending, seems almost foreign in a culture driven by consumerism. But several years ago, my family experienced a holiday that would redefine what it meant to celebrate. It started with a difficult decision, one that I hoped would teach us all a valuable lesson. I had recently moved to a small farm in the countryside, a place I had dreamed of living for years, but with the move came new challenges. I had to leave behind my job in the city, and the income was much less than I had anticipated. The financial strain, combined with the pressures of adapting to a rural lifestyle, meant that this Christmas was going to be unlike any other we had before. My children, Hannah, who was 12, Liam, who was 16, and Grace, who was 9, were used to bigger celebrations. Last year, we had hosted a big family gathering, complete with a feast, extravagant gifts, and an abundance of decorations. But this year, with my newfound budget constraints, I had to tell them that Christmas would be different. "You've said that before, Mom," Hannah remarked with a raised eyebrow, echoing my own frustrations from previous years. They hadn't fully believed my promise to cut back on spending the year before when we'd gone through a rough financial patch. This year, however, I was determined to keep my word. There was no room for extravagance, but I knew there had to be another way to make the holiday meaningful. A week before Christmas, I found myself staring out the window of our small farmhouse searching for inspiration. We had recently moved into an old farmhouse on a piece of land that I had always wanted to restore. But instead of excitement, I was overwhelmed. The house was a maze of outdated rooms, creaky floors, and peeling wallpaper. The backyard, once a thriving orchard, had fallen into disrepair. I had no budget for repairs or redecorating, and it was hard to see past the clutter and chaos. It was Grace, my youngest, who first mentioned the idea that changed everything. One night, as we sat by the fireplace, she asked if we could do something special for Christmas. "Maybe we could make the house look pretty," she suggested, "like it used to be, the way you always made our other homes feel so nice." That was the spark I needed. I could still create something beautiful for us, even if it meant using the resources we already had. I began brainstorming ways to transform our farmhouse, even with limited funds. I would use what was available: nature, creativity, and a little bit of hard work. The first step was to take a trip into town and visit the local thrift store. With only $20 in my pocket, I managed to find a collection of mismatched plates, an old wooden table, and a few vintage tablecloths. I spent hours cleaning and painting, restoring the furniture, and creating a rustic holiday centerpiece out of pine cones, dried flowers, and twigs I had gathered from the woods. It wasn't much, but I was determined to make it meaningful. Next, I focused on the Christmas tree. I had always loved decorating trees with my children, but this year I couldn't afford to buy ornaments. Instead, I turned to our farm for inspiration. We made homemade garlands from popcorn and cranberries, and I even found an old string of lights in the attic. For the first time in years, the tree was simple but full of charm, and every ornament had a story behind it. On Christmas Eve, I handed each of my children a piece of plain paper and asked them to write a letter to someone they cared about. It didn't have to be perfect, or even about gifts, just something meaningful. They grumbled at first, but I convinced them that the letters would be their gift to someone special. Each letter had a unique theme: what I love about my mom, what I admire about my sister, and what I appreciate about my brother. While they wrote, I retreated to the kitchen to prepare the modest Christmas dinner. I had no fancy dishes, but I made do with a simple roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and some vegetables from our garden. When I set the table, I looked at the rustic yet beautiful arrangements I had created. Simple, but filled with love and care. After dinner, we gathered around the tree. The kids handed me their letters one by one, and I read them aloud. There were no extravagant words or dramatic declarations, but the sincerity in their letters was enough to fill my heart. I couldn't help but smile as each of my children shared their thoughts about one another. Liam, my oldest, had written to his sister Grace, "What I love about you is how you always make me laugh even when I'm feeling down." Hannah, usually the quiet one, had written to Liam, "What I admire about you is how hard you work on the farm and never complain." Grace, with her bubbly personality, had written to me, "What I love about you is how you always know how to make everything better." The moment was emotional for all of us, and even Liam, usually too grown up for sentimentality, had to wipe away a tear. Afterwards, we spent the evening talking and laughing together, realizing how much we had come to appreciate each other, not for what we could give, but for who we were. The next morning we woke up to a snowy wonderland outside. The tree was still adorned with simple but beautiful ornaments, and the house, though humble, felt warm and inviting. As I looked at my children, their eyes sparkled with joy. I knew that we had created something far more meaningful than any store-bought gift could offer. It was not the Christmas I had originally envisioned, but in many ways it was better. It taught us the value of gratitude, of creating beauty out of what we had, and most of all, the importance of spending time with those we loved. Years later, we look back on that Christmas as the one that changed everything. We had plenty of other holidays with bigger trees and more presents, but none of them had the same depth of meaning as that simple Christmas spent together in our farmhouse. That year, we learned that true happiness isn't about what we get, but about what we give, whether that's in the form of a handwritten letter, a homemade ornament, or a shared moment of love and laughter. Thank you for listening to today's story on Story Loft. We hope that these stories brought a little light to your day. If you enjoy them, please like, comment, and subscribe to join our growing community of positivity and inspiration. Remember, your story could make a difference too. Email us at storyloft@outlook.com with your own inspiring tale. We can't wait to hear from you, and we will see you soon. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.